forming a collaborative group. And at that point, we had the idea, and we had worked not only with the utilities, but a variety of other stakeholders, including REAP with Chris and others, and including independent power producers, the state of Alaska. The Department of Defense was part of that group that had the conversation as well. So we were collaborating around this idea called the Railbelt Reliability Council, which is an organization to do planning and standards and interconnection agreement for the rail belt. At the time, we needed some enabling legislation. So we all went down together and supported Senate Bill 123. And now we're at the other side after getting that passed. And we're gonna give you an update on that because a lot has happened in the last year and there's a lot more to do. So I appreciate Chris, who's also part of the Railbelt Reliability Implementation Committee, which is a group of stakeholders that is putting together this group or this organization. Appreciate him joining me on this presentation. So if you just want to go to the next slide, Erin, that would be great. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we're trying to accomplish, what SB 123 did, that was again passed last year by the legislature, what's happening at the RCA now with that, and a little bit about the Railbelt Reliability Implementation Committee and next steps. So if you want to go on to the next slide, we have a pretty astute group on this call today, but here is what the Railbelt system looks like. So it stretches from Fairbanks and over to Delta and all the way down to Homer. This is the state's really only quote unquote grid, although we refer to it more affectionately as a long extension cord because it does not have a lot of the robust properties of the standard grids in the lower 48, Europe, other places. But we are in an interconnected system with now 5 utilities. In fact, we actually had to change this map just last week because it showed MLMP on there. But as many of you know, Chugach Electric has purchased and consumed MLMP, and that's now 1 utility. So now there's 5 of us operating on this this interconnected system. And Chris, do you want to take the next one?
Sure. So what are the problems they're trying to solve? A lot of folks have been looking at this issue of the rail belt working together for a long time. In fact, it was interesting to me. I got a great email from a former general manager of MEA who managed MEA in the 80s after Senate Bill 123 was passed. And he sent me kind of a funny note saying, we thought we were going to do this in 1984. So people have been trying to do this for some time. In 2015, the Regulatory Commission sent a letter to the legislature in June stating what it thought were some of its main concerns with the way the grid was running. And one of those was reliability and the lack of region-wide reliability standards. But after a lot of generation had just recently been built, the commission was also concerned that rail belt consumers get the best bang for their buck with some more integration of the way the grid was operated. Again, that was June 2015. REAP and others have been talking about some kind of a reform in the grid for some time. The idea of a system operator had come up. That would be a little bit different than an electric reliability organization. And the electric reliability organization, I think, was the consensus model that both utilities and non-utilities felt they could bring to Juneau and say, hey, we really need something like this. And so that was done in January of last year. And with a lot of hard work by the legislature and staff and everybody else who supported it, that bill was passed in just a few months and signed into law in April. As I mentioned, the reliability standards is a issue, but in particular, the cybersecurity threats is a concern of the commission. We have seen and hear about cybersecurity threats more and more these days. And without a region-wide set of reliability standards, that's much more difficult to deal with. Also on the transmission and generation side, we really need to have some kind of region-wide planning. It makes a lot more sense for all the utilities who are sharing this grid to be sharing planning for the future. And in particular with transmission, one of the issues that we've got is that we don't have a agreed upon allocation system for costs if new transmission is built and that transmission benefits more than one utility. So one of the things that Senate Bill 123 specifically states is that the tariff or the rules of this new electric reliability organization have to include a way to fairly allocate costs of new transmission. It also requires that the tariff include interconnection rules for independent power producers and others who want to connect into the grid that are non-discriminatory and open. Those rules are very important if we want to level the playing field for others who would like to participate in the grid. Another thing that Senate Bill 123, I think, is addressing is just how we can do all this while at the same time being able to address local needs. And we're working that out. Each of the electric reliability organizations in the state is going to be a little bit different. This bill has statewide impact, but the way it's written and the way that it applies now is really just to the rail belt. So it could be that there are other areas of the state that someday will have an electric reliability organization. And so we had to have a bill that would be both broad enough to cover all these different situations, but also flexible enough to allow local needs to be met. Now, one of the things that REAP is really concerned about as a renewable energy advocate and education group is making sure that the technology that's changing so fast is brought into the grid. When I started REAP 17 years ago, I talked about the time when the lines would cross and that renewable energy would be cheaper than other kinds of energy. And that line has been crossed in many, many jurisdictions around the world right now. It is the fact that solar and wind are the cheapest electricity on the planet now in many, many places. So how are we going to be able to integrate that fast changing technology, including energy storage, which is coming down in cost almost as quickly as wind and solar, and make sure that all of those kinds of technologies are applied in the grid as appropriate. So the organization, as we have so far developed it, will allow for a lot of collaboration and I think constructive resolution of issues. It's important to note that the Railbelt Reliability Council is forming so it can apply under Senate Bill 123 to become the electric reliability organization for the rail belt. It is not a done deal that the Railbelt Reliability Council will actually become the ERO, but we're really hoping that the application that we can put together will be accepted by the commission and they will certificate the Railbelt Reliability Council to become the ERO for the rail belt. That has a lot to do with the rules that the Regulatory Commission of Alaska is making right now. That's a parallel path that's happening at the same time we're working to put together the RRC. So I'll pass it on to you, Julie.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think for us that last bullet there is really key. It really provides a new avenue for us to have conversations and come to resolution as a group. So we've got, as Chris mentioned, there's he's actually one of the independent members currently on the Railbelt Reliability Council Implementation Committee. There are independent power producers, there are consumer advocacy groups, and this really provides a path, a place for those conversations to happen, and something with teeth and regulation behind it, so those conversations result in action. But in the past, there have not been those avenues, either as a parent or with the authority that this does, to have those decisions stand and not have to end up being fought either in a regulatory, legislative, or judicial arena. So we've already seen this be successful. In fact, even around something like there's a bill going through the legislature right now, Senate Bill 69 on continuing the exemption of independent power producers from RCA regulation. And we've been able to come together as a group around the RRC and have conversations about the potential impacts of this, where in the past we would have had those conversations in front of the legislature on the record. So it's just a much, it's a more cohesive way and collaborative way of coming to resolution. So Erin, sorry, I brought us back to slide 4, but you can go to slide 5. So just a history of where this Railbelt Reliability Council came from. And I do want to thank Chris for, we talk in a lot of acronyms, there's a lot of words being thrown around. So the ERO is the Electric Reliability Organization, and that's what's listed in statute, that the RCA shall form an Electric Reliability Organization. Concurrent to that, the Railbelt Reliability Council is a group of interested volunteers, basically at this point, that are trying to form an organization that will then apply to become the ERO. So all of this started, well, it's, as Chris mentioned, it started decades ago with all of these conversations, but the most recent, the group ArcTech, which is a group of railbelt utilities, came together and had this studied by an outside group of experts. They came up with the Railbelt Reliability Council concept. And there was a group called the Organizational Development Team, which was utility representatives, 6 each from the 6 utilities, who was trying to move this forward. And again, at that time, that was groundbreaking. The 6 utilities had never agreed on a path forward on this. So that was in itself a huge effort. That group then, once we had kind of, okay, the utilities can agree to this, let's bring the other stakeholders in. So again, that's when we reached out to another group of stakeholders, and through about a year-long process, came to an organization that we could all at least agree to move forward with. And so that was, again, a group of utility and non-utility stakeholders moving together. Once we had something that we all felt comfortable with, on December 18th, 2019, we signed the MOU for the creation of the RRC and filed that with the RCA. And again, that required some enabling legislation. And I think, Chris, that's the next slide that you'll cover. But I just, and before we go there, just wanted to recognize Kathy Giesel on the call here. Kathy was instrumental and the bill sponsor of Senate Bill 123, and just so appreciative, Kathy, of your leadership and your staff's work on this, because it never would have happened without that. So thank you. All right, you can head over. I'll pass it to you, Chris.
Okay. Well, this is a little bit of a repeat of what I've already said, which is Senate Bill 123 actually established a framework for the ERO to operate under the RCA's authority. So the RCA will still hover over the Electric Reliability Organization, but the ERO will have certain discrete functions that it can take over, including both the development and the enforcement of reliability standards. The utilities came together and brought some agreed upon reliability standards to the commission back in 2018, but those have not been promulgated and there's no enforcement yet. So I think what the ERO will do once one is certificated is look at what the utilities have already looked at for reliability standards and then submit those to the commission. But there will also be enforcement of those reliability standards, violations if they occur, and the ERO will take care of that. And those, again, those reliability standards are really surrounding the issue of both cybersecurity and the day-to-day operations of the grid. The next thing that's really important is a robust and transparent integrated resource planning process. IRPs, as they're called, are pretty common in the lower 48. An IRP, once it's done, does not mandate that anything get built, but what Senate Bill 123 does is require an IRP process, and it basically says that if a project's not in the IRP, a utility is going to have a lot of good reasons for building it anyway. So this is a really important part of the bill, which is for the first time the commission, the Regulatory Commission of Alaska, has authority to essentially pre-approve all projects. And that will occur now both through whether or not a project in an IRP that's submitted to the commission, or if a project wants to get built outside of the IRP process, there's a whole nother part of the legislation that will develop a set of procedures for a utility to go to the commission outside of an IRP process and ask for permission to build. That's super important. There aren't that many jurisdictions around the country where utilities can build without pre-approval. And so we're glad that we now have a mechanism to do planning. And the IRP process is going to be, something that probably happens about every 3 years. That's what the current draft regulations are looking like. It's probably going to be kind of an ongoing process. And that's a good thing because, as I mentioned before, technology is changing quite quickly. People's interests in different kinds of technology and their demand for different technology is changing quickly. And so integrated resource planning will be part of the new grid. And I mentioned the pre-approval. The last thing I think, which is what we're all dealing with right now, is the timelines. The legislation requires that the Regulatory Commission establish final rules by July 1st of 2021. And I think back in March of 2020, that seemed far away, and now it seems really close. So everyone's been working really hard in front of the commission since about June of last year to develop rules that I think will probably be the subject of the next slide, but a lot of rules have to be made to implement Senate Bill 123. As is typical, most legislation does not get into every nitty-gritty detail. And so an administrative agency has to make rules to create those details, and that's what's going on right now. We're hoping that the applications to become the ERO for the rail belt will be due sometime in the fall, roughly around October. And so the RRC is also working feverishly to develop its bylaws, articles of incorporation, code of conduct, and other procedures that we feel we're going to have to include in the application by the fall. So there, again, there's two parallel processes going on right now. One to develop the rules of the RCA and one to develop the organization of the RRC. And I'll pass it back to you, Julie.
Thanks, Chris. So Aaron, if you want to go to slide 7. This talks a little bit about what is happening at the RCA right now. So as Chris mentioned, through Senate Bill 123, the RCA was tasked with developing regulations by July 31st, 2021, which is a very compressed timeline. So typically an RCA docket around rulemaking like this would take 2 years, and we're compressing it down to 1, largely because people were just anxious to see this happen. They did not want it to languish. So a pretty aggressive timeline was put in there. We're all finding that timeline has been somewhat problematic, but we're all trying to work the best that we can towards that timeline, as long as it doesn't impact the due process that rulemaking dockets are supposed to go through. So there's 3 dockets. There was enough work that the RCA decided to break this into 3 dockets that are happening somewhat concurrently. The first is a 001 docket, which is focused on governance and other foundational elements around the concept of balance and independence, around transparency, and around the public process. As Chris mentioned, through Senate Bill 123, the RCA is deferring some of its processes, but not necessarily its oversight. And so while I don't know if I love Chris's term of the RCA is going to hover over the process as a utility, that makes me a little nervous. But we do want them to have oversight. And that was part of the concept from the beginning, is that the RCA will have oversight of what this looks like. And, so that's what we're going through right now, is what does that oversight look like? How much oversight is required? And it's an interesting time, because there's people giving away some of the things that they normally do, like utilities are normally responsible for all of these things. And so we're the ones beholden to our members and the ratepayers. It's our fiduciary responsibility, our boards. And so we have concern that giving all of these decision-making powers over to another group is going to result in things that we are then going to be accountable to our ratepayers that we don't have full control over. So that's scary. And we want to make sure that there's things in place to protect our members from that. The RCA is also giving up some of their usual powers. And so it's been interesting to watch us all struggle with how to create regulations that offer protections, but also allow us to do things in a new way. Because I think we've all committed moving forward to doing things in a different way. We're all very committed to this structure. And so the devil has been in some of the details, and there's been reams and reams of paper. If anybody has having any sleeping issues, I would encourage you to follow this docket. There are reams and reams and reams of comments, all great and not all aligned. So it's been an interesting process to watch all of us come to terms with how this should look and not have all the answers, but still be working towards the best solution. So the 002 docket is focused on the integrated resource planning, what that looks like, what is required, how much the RCA does versus how much the ERO does, where the public process is and all of that. And then also the pre-approval of large projects. And this is another thing that was a big let go moment for the utilities that previously requirement. But again, in the spirit of this new way of working, we all agreed that that was something that would be amenable as part of this process. So looking at the regulations for that, what it looks like, how you handle projects that are happening right now before this process happens, or is official with grandfathering, all of those are elements that we're grappling with. And then 003 is the devil's in the details around the tariff, filing requirements, and we are knee deep in that as well. And as Chris mentioned, the tariff will cover, there's kind of a couple different levels of the tariff. The one Chris mentioned was, okay, how do we recover costs that are system-wide, that have system-wide benefits that we do as a group? But then also just tariffs deal with what's the cost of this organization and how do we make sure that the costs don't outweigh the benefits? And that's something that we're all paying attention to because there's a lot of process that can be brought to this. And so making sure that the costs of the don't outweigh the benefits of the organization is something that we all want to make sure that we're keeping an eye on. And that is all happening around the tariff and the filing requirements. So all of the different stakeholder groups are participating in the dockets as individuals or organizations, and we have not yet filed any comments as the RRC Implementation Committee. While we do have things happening in parallel streams to make sure that we can all meet the different timeline requirements, we have not come to a point yet where we're parallel enough that we have not come to the point yet where the RRC IC Implementation Committee that's putting together all of this has agreement and is ahead of the process enough to make comments as the IC. So we've all been participating as individuals, which has also been an interesting part of the process because we have our Monday afternoon meetings with the IC where we're having conversations about some of these things, making some decisions, but then there's a separate regulatory process. And sometimes how things are represented are different in that process. And so it has been interesting times, absolutely. But I think through it all, we're gaining a much deeper understanding and a much more tangible understanding of each of our positions and what each group needs in the process. And so I think we'll end up better for it on the outside. But there has been really a lot of agreement during the RRC Implementation Committee meetings. In fact, almost all of our votes have been unanimous. So it's been a really great process that has just, like I said, it's a really interesting part of the history of the rail belt to be a part of. Chris.
Thanks, Julie. So Aaron, I think I'll take the next two. So let's go to number 8, please. We've talked about what the purpose of the Railbelt Reliability Council is. It's basically to oversee the functions that have been outlined in Senate Bill 123. But it's important to note number 4 here. What the Electric Reliability Organization legislation does not require, and yet everyone is interested in looking at, is that the entire rail belt become one single load balancing area. And without getting into the weeds of what that means, essentially right now, well, in the past, we have had each of the 6 utilities historically been operating on their own, balancing supply and demand in their respective service areas. There certainly have been contracts and, you know, power sales agreements that have occurred, but there's been, everybody's been dispatching their own power for their own utility. What we would like to see is a single load balancing area and what's called economic dispatch, which means security constrained merit order economic dispatch means that each of the most efficient generators in the entire rail belt would go on in order, not necessarily the way it is now, which is the most efficient generator of each utility goes on in order. There was not enough consensus to say that should be part of the legislation, so it's not part of the legislation. Having said that, I think we want to continue to look at that. So number 4 states that what the ERO will do is perform a definitive cost benefit analysis of what a security constrained economic dispatch system would look like. There's
And Chris, would you say we, you mean REAP, not the RRC implementation committee at that point?
No, what I'm saying is that the RRC would like to do this cost benefit analysis.
Right. But when you started it out, you had said what we would like to see is economic dispatch, one load balancing area. I just want to clarify when we're talking, because we're here having the presentation on behalf of the RRC, that we're making it clear.
Okay.
Organization versus.
Thanks, Julie. So yeah, REAP would like to see that. I think lots of some utilities have stated that they would like to see that.
Mm-hmm.
Not all of the utilities have stated that they would like to see that. And so what we want to try to get at some point is some definitive analysis of what the benefits and costs of having a single load balancing area would be. The point here is, though, that Senate Bill 123 did not require that. Another thing that Senate Bill 123 did not require is that we get to one universal transmission tariff for the rail belt. Right now, one of the concerns that certainly REAP has, but I think some of the utilities and certainly independent power producers have, is that each of the utilities, because they own parts of the transmission system, can charge a tariff or a fee for electrons moving through their service area. So that means if you're moving electricity across the grid, you could pay more than, and likely are going to pay more than, one fee for moving those electrons. So the cost of delivering electricity can get quite expensive depending on how many different service areas you're trying to go through. And we call those pancaking transmission tariffs because they pancake one on top of another. Again, Senate Bill 123 did not get to that problem specifically. It does require, as I said before, cost allocation principles to be developed for new transmission, but it does not quite get to a requirement that we go back and look at existing legacy transmission and figure out how to deal with those costs and perhaps allocate them differently. We hope, REAP hopes, I think a lot of people would hope that we would get to the point where we would be able to do that. So number 4 really is a little bit more about what the Senate Bill 123 is not. Number 9 here, I just go through the entities that are part of the implementation committee. The 6 railbelt utilities is a little bit off. We probably should have caught that change because there's now only 5 railbelt utilities. As we all know, MLMP recently got purchased by Chugach Electric. However, Doyon Utilities, which services the military bases on the rail belt, has replaced MLMP. So there still are 6 utilities as part of the implementation committee. Alaska Energy Authority, which owns assets, both generation and transmission assets, and represents the state on the implementation committee. So there are 2 independent power producers that are part of the implementation committee. And one organization that advocates for consumer interests, that's ACPERG. There's 2 non-affiliated members, REAP is currently one of those non-affiliated members, and there's an independent voice that's the other. More than likely, the way that the draft regulations are looking for the at the Regulatory Commission, this list will change a little bit, and we will probably have a second consumer seat on there, and we probably just have one independent seat. In any scenario, the legislation requires that the RCA and the Attorney General's Office, RAPA, hold non-voting ex officio seats. So right now we have actually 12 members of this implementation committee meeting, as Julie pointed out, every Monday. We have not chosen another large consumer seat, but I think what the RRC is thinking is that that would be what we do, and that what we would include in our application. And if it were certificated, we would add a 13th seat. We're also, and I think that Julie will talk about this a little bit in the next slide, we split up into many subcommittees now, and trying to get a lot of the hard work done through subcommittees. So right now, the governance structure that we are looking at is this one. And we hope that the commission will find this to be a balanced stakeholder group. There are some folks on the implementation committee, I would say that include REAP, that believe it's not just the composition of the board that would define whether or not this group is balanced, but also the composition of the committees, as well as the voting structure, the voting thresholds that this group decides upon. So we're still working out the details on the committees and the voting thresholds, and we believe we'll get that stuff done here relatively quickly. So moving on to you, Julie.
Thanks. Yeah, and as Chris mentioned, the RCA is writing these regulations that will define what needs to go in these applications. And so one of the elements of Senate Bill 123 was that the board either needed to be independent, balanced, or a combination of the two. And so, as Chris mentioned, we're going for that combination with that independent seat. And one of the requirements of the current draft regulations, again, not permanent, is that it needs to have an uneven number of board members. And so that is, we're in looking at what the regulations are, we're making sure that we fit that. And as Chris said, not just in who's sitting around the table, but in how decisions are made. So here's what we've done so far. We've completed the application designation process to fill all the board seats. That was a big lift in the spring, putting out. There were some that were applications and some that were designated by specific constituencies. For instance, the Independent Power Producers Group, we asked them to provide two seats, to fill 2 seats. Not only the primary person who sits there, but also each seat has an alternate, and those alternates have been extremely important in accomplishing the work that we have. So it's been a great group to work with. MLP was then replaced by Doyon, as Chris mentioned. We've developed draft articles of incorporation and approved duties of care, a sort of code of conduct light, for how we will all act in the best interest of the implementation committee. We've hired resources to provide subject matter expertise. We've got a facilitation project management person. We've got somebody helping us with corporate law, drafting the bylaws, and then somebody else helping us scope out tariff and application requirements. So those are the resources that we've brought on so far. Again, we've tentatively agreed to this 13 voting member governance structure to provide and meet the requirements around balance. And again, that may adjust as the regulations adjust. Again, we definitely have established in our group what we feel like is the best structure. We also really want to make sure that we have a structure that is accepted by the RCA. But primarily, we're looking at Senate Bill 123. That's our guidance. And that's really what we're using to make sure that our organization is in compliance. But we absolutely need to fit the regulations as well. So things may adjust as the regulations are promulgated and finalized. And we've established standing and ad hoc committees, as Chris mentioned. This is really where the work's getting done. So there's a bylaw subcommittee. In addition to our weekly 3 to 4 hour meeting. They're meeting a couple hours a week as well. So this is taking considerable time from the folks that are involved and effort. So there's a budget and work planning subcommittee. There is a bylaw subcommittee. We just also stood up one on standards, one on the tariff, and one on integrated resource planning. So this is the group that's fleshing out what these will look like for the Railbelt Reliability Council. And we've also, as I said, developed the budget and work plan, and per the MOU that we signed, those costs are currently being split by the load serving entities, so the 5 Railbelt utilities, and we split that up by load ratio share. So that's how the costs are currently being divided, and the RCA is creating regulations that will help us understand how that's done in the future. And we've developed a draft first year budget for the RRC. And again, a lot of that will depend on how the regulations turn out. And that's where some of the costs equaling the benefits come together as well. That draft budget can vary widely depending on how often the IRP needs to happen, whether board members receive compensation, what kind of compliance and monitoring we need to have, what the subcommittees look like. So all of those things will impact cost drastically. So that's a work in progress right now, but we're making sure again that we're keeping it as lean as possible. As we went to the legislature last year, one of the things we talked about was keeping it lean, making sure benefits outweighed the costs, and utilizing as much of our internal resources as possible. Chris.
Thanks. The number 11, please, Aaron. So I'll start from the last point here and kind of work backwards. As I mentioned before, we're expecting that the application to the commission is going to be due October 1st. And the regulations are not going to be finalized till July 1st. And so we are working as hard as we can now without the guide of final regulations to develop bylaws and articles of incorporation and other items so that when the regulations come out in July and we get some final guidance on what we're supposed to be doing, that we use those 90 days between July 1st and October 1st very efficiently. As Julie mentioned, all of us are working really hard on this, at least 3 hours every Monday since July. We've been meeting, and now a lot of subcommittee work as well. So the work plan for the application is still something that is a little bit fuzzy to some of us in terms of what exactly the commission is going to be requiring of us. For example, the legislation says that the ERO has to have a tariff with interconnection standards and reliability standards. And I think that everybody realizes that that doesn't mean that our tariff has to have final reliability standards and final interconnection standards when we apply. But just exactly what level of detail we have to put into our application is something we're working out and trying to get more guidance on from the commission. We are expecting that what we're going to need to do is have enough detail to demonstrate this organization has the ability to do the work that's required by Senate Bill 123. So we'll have to look at what the process, for instance, is of developing standards, enforcing standards. One of the issues that has been on my mind individually over the last few weeks is how the ERO is going to hold a hearing, because the statute says that to enforce reliability standards, the ERO has to hold a hearing. So that I think contemplates a whole other set of requirements that the ERO has to figure out and has to develop, so that in our application we can point out to the commission we're able to hold a hearing too, so we can do objective enforcement of reliability standards. So things like developing the tariff, as Julie mentioned, we've hired an expert to help us with what should be in there. We're reporting to the commission between now and then, and certainly have been getting feedback from the commission through the public meetings and the technical conferences that they have held. For instance, we just had in late February a 3-day technical conference with the commission, where we went over about 60 different questions related to the regulations that will have to be developed for things like tariff and interconnection standards and so on. So there's been a lot of public meetings and technical conferences in front of the commission where we've gotten some information. So we just have a lot of work between now and then, and we're hoping that the commission will get the draft regulations sometime in the next 30 to 45 days. There'll be a required 30-day comment period. That's probably the deadline or the timeline they have to be on in order to be done by July 1st. And I think that will give us some time to, as a Railbelt Reliability Council, to figure out where we may need to make some tweaks. Next, please. And Julie, why don't you take this one?
Sure. So for those of you who may be afraid of commitment, this slide is scary, but this is really the foundation of what we're creating here. And it was important for initially the utilities and then all the stakeholders to come together around these commitments and what they meant. And again, this is why the fear factor of making these commitments and having regulations that provide a process that can be trusted and relied upon is so important to every member of the group. So one, it's a commitment to be inclusive of a variety of perspectives and in our decisions relating to the Railbelt bulk electric system. And in the past, each utility has been able to make their own decisions about what was built and how they handled reliability, how they handled generation. This is now opening it up to a larger group of people. And those perspectives we're finding are excellent. It's been great to have those perspectives around the table. Decisions take longer to make, of course, and there's a lot more conversation and vetting that needs to happen, which is only good for the process. It's a commitment for the utilities and the other stakeholders to be bound by the decisions of the RRC, and for all the stakeholders to have a forum to collaborate around those issues. So not just in what's built, but also how we want to manage, what we want this to be. And so those conversations have been starting, and again, the group perspective has made that a much more rich and comprehensive discussion. And a commitment of all the stakeholders to achieve the benefits for the ratepayers. And I think that's kind of the fun thing, is that we're all flying the banner for the consumers. And it's been interesting to realize that we all feel as though we're the advocate for our members, or for the ratepayers, for the consumers. We're all just coming at it from different lenses, and those different lenses are all very important. But each one of us, well, I guess IPPs sometimes are representing a different interest, but potentially with profit. But generally, I think the people sitting around the table, IPPs included, are really interested in what's best for the consumers, and so that's been a good starting place for all of these sometimes tough conversations. And I wanted to just mention a few things. Chris brought up load balancing area, but just to cover some of the other things that are happening on the Railbelt, since we're talking, as everybody likely on this call knows, MLMP was purchased, creating one load balancing area between MLMP and Chugach's service territory, and one utility serving the primary part of Anchorage, not the entire municipality, since MEA serves the Eagle River to Eklutna portion. MEA and Chugach are right now working on a tight power pool, which is the sharing of generation resources. That was part of the sale agreement from the RCA, that was mandated, although that was already in the works. The RCA established a timeline that we are on track of to be doing that tight pool by April 30th. So that's moving along as well. MEA and Chugach are also looking at developing the one load balancing area, which means not only are we sharing generation resources, but we're taking a joint responsibility to regulate frequency and other items. And so that also factors into, the larger the load balancing area, the more options you have around regulating frequency, which allows you sometimes to integrate more variable power because you've got a larger area to work with. So that's also in the works as a stipulation of the MLMP sale by April 30th in a year from now. And then on the other end of the grid, we've got Battle Creek diversion, which increased the amount of water available in the Bradley Lake Hydro Plant. That happened this year, and as well as some critical transmission assets linking the Bradley project to points north of the Kenai. That was purchased by AEA, and that will help us secure that power source for Alaskans and make sure that that is a critical link. We saw during the Swan Lake fire a couple years ago now that when that link was down, it costs ratepayers north of the Kenai millions. And so that was an extremely important asset, thanks to the leadership of the Alaska Energy Authority and Tony Izzo, my boss, is chair of the BPMC, the Bradley Project Group. That was a really big win for ratepayers everywhere, both those projects. So there's some other exciting things happening, even though the rest of us are consumed with the Railbelt Reliability Council, associated regulations, and hopefully we'll just have more positive outcomes, not only with the RRC, but other things that are happening. So I'm sure we're over our time now, so I'll wrap it up quickly and be happy for questions.
Okay, great, thank you. Marianne, you had a question, you want to start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I just want to commend the entire Railbelt group in finally taking steps to make this dream more of a reality. I know there's still a lot of work ahead of everyone, and I think that cooperation between all the entities is critical. But I think kudos to all of you. Thank you for your presentation today. This is a significant move forward. You know, in the lower 48, many entities were mandated to do this by FERC. I sit on the board of one of them, the Northwest Power Pool. And all of their members have come together for billions of dollars of savings for the utilities and the ultimate customers. I hope that you always keep that eye on the objective of the benefit for the end users, as well as the continuation of the utilities, because we have to make sure that everyone is kept whole in the process. Can you talk a little bit about what the transition means with the Regulatory Commission of Alaska, the new commissioner, Keith Kuber, coming on? You know, it always seems like we make all this progress and then we have new people coming in and they have to be re-educated. But, you know, so tell me what, you know, your public outreach, kind of the information outreach is going to look like, not only for the commission, but for your end user customers.
Thanks, Marianne. I will try to take a stab at that. Chris, you can jump in. The good news is there is a very thorough public record on this docket. Poor Commissioner Cooper is going to be busy, not only on this, but there's just really a lot going on at the RCA right now. And so it is going to be tough to lose Commissioner McAlpine, as he was a key member of all of this, really driving towards excellence and a change. And so his impact will be lost for sure. But we are interested in seeing where the new commissioner is coming from, and I'm sure he'll have lots of opportunities to connect with fellow commissioners, and we're absolutely open to any assistance we can give to bring him up to speed. We do have, like I said, two commissioners, one main and one alternate on the RRC. However, they've taken a step back from our meetings just because of the regulation dockets in process. It's a little problematic for them to, with ex parte rules, and it was just, and their timeline, it was just hard for them to participate in a way that felt comfortable. So they will rejoin once the dockets are closed. So we have less interaction with the commissioners on a direct level around the RRC, but again, happy to provide the new commissioner anything. And Marianne, you said it, I mean, this is a really, one of the most important things we could be doing for ratepayers, but the minute you start talking about it, eyes glaze over a little bit because it's at that technical level. But I think each of us has a different platform and a way to communicate with members the power of the organization that we're creating. And Chris just did a great forum for REAP members. We talk about it all the time in our newsletters. And I think there's still a lot of unknowns. So what we can do is champion and cheer what we're trying to accomplish and know and have faith that we're going to get there and bring members along the way. But member participation, the public participation is a huge component of the RRC and any RCA process. So we want to make sure people are knowledgeable. So thanks for the question. Chris, do you want to add anything?
Oh, I would just emphasize that public process. Like I said before, I think that's going to be the gist of a lot of what we have to include in the RRC's application in the fall, is how will the public processes of the RRC work to include all kinds of public input in these different functions, primarily integrated resource planning, but there will be opportunities for the public to get involved even in some of the more arcane things like development of reliability standards. We'll see who really gets involved in that, but I think it is important that we are developing those processes. And there will probably be some input, I would suspect, from the public during the 30-day public comment period on the regs that will be coming up sometime between now and July.
Okay, I'm going to call an audible for Tony Izzo. Tony, you want to open your mic and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. I think it was more of a comment on a couple of things. Chris talked about I think it was Chris talked about pre-approval for large generation transmission, or anything 15 megawatts or larger, I believe. And MEA certainly supports that. I think Chugach Electric is very comfortable with that. And just to point out that the vast majority of cooperatives in the lower 48 are not regulated at all. They're tend to be smaller than what you see in the Railbelt, actually. And most of them, for the most part, don't have G&T, generation transmission, and they're not vertically integrated. So we are unique on a couple of fronts. I think for those that are not comfortable with, but certainly have signed on to the fact that there's going to be pre-approval required for any new generation, certainly transmission that, again, that is large enough, there's a real benefit to it. And that is the certainty and the ability to go out and get the lowest interest rates. Because think about it, you get to go to your lenders and say, well, whatever it is, whether it's going to be a new wind farm or whatever, or some thermal generation that's going to be more efficient up north in Fairbanks, you're going to be able to say with certainty that I have the approval of the Regulatory Commission and this ERO / this integrated resource plan that commits, it provides certainty that you're going to recover the costs and the debt service through your rates. There's really no better certainty than you can find than pledging the payments of an essential service. People send us 12 checks a year. Well, hopefully not, but more and more electronic payments. But there's a lot of security in that. So I think that there's, in the future, what we'll see is not only a better plan, so that we're not just coordinating within our certificated boundaries, but I think we'll even do better in terms of access to capital. And then on the pancake rate topic, as not-for-profit cooperatives, our regulatory compact, in exchange for being a monopoly, we're regulated, and that's a pretty transparent process, and you get a pretty good scrubbing on your rates. We're allowed a small margin just so that we can ensure that we're doing the right prudent things. But when I look at the rates for transmission or any utility, it's to meet an RCA approved revenue requirement. And I think initially, I would hate for folks to think that, and I support an open access transmission tariff for all of the transmission from the north to the south. But I would compare it to, instead of having a stack of pancakes, you're going to have one pancake that's going to be just as thick, because the revenue requirements don't automatically go down, not initially. Now, I think in the future, with coordinated planning and the ability to seek maybe lower cost funding with siting authority and the certainty that that brings, we can, I think it's the right step towards what would be lower cost, but it's not going to result in that immediately. Probably the most immediate benefit would be for those that want to interconnect, having the one-stop shop versus having to go and look at what, coordinate with Chugach and then call MEA or AEA and look at the Northern Intertide Tariff, that kind of thing. Anyway, thanks to you both. I thought it was a really good presentation.
Thanks, Tony.
All right, we do have some questions in chat. Just a reminder to everybody online, we are close to time or maybe at time. But with your indulgence, we'll just go through a couple of these questions. A question from Bob Cox. Do we know enough yet about the recent failures in Texas and their power grid system to glean any lessons learned? Will the RRC be able to apply some of those lessons to protect Alaska from some?
That's a great hot topic. We've been talking about that quite a bit. There's some important differences between Texas and Alaska. First of all, Texas chose not to be part of the Eastern or Western interconnections. Alaska doesn't really have a choice. We are out here by ourselves, so it's not like we're doing something. We're doing the best we can, I think, with what we've got. But I think the big problem in Texas, and I'm no expert, but certainly been reading a lot about it like everyone else, has been their wholesale power market. And we're not close to having that kind of a market here in the Railbelt anytime soon. But I think that's what the major problem was there, because they just were not paying for the kinds of resiliency and the kind of reliability that we have taken for granted here. We definitely winterize things up here. We spend money to make sure that our systems are reliable, and they were able to cut costs quite a bit because of the way that their market was set up.
Kind of like comparing Florida construction standards to Alaska construction standards.
Yeah. It's we could go on. I mean, there's certainly some parallels that we want to avoid, but I don't think there's a huge comparison.
Yeah, we've definitely been having conversations about it at the RRC. I think it's been a good thing to watch from afar and learn lessons from. And I think important for everybody that sits around that RRC table to recognize the gravity of what they're doing here and what we're all doing and trying to accomplish, and the responsibility that it comes with to the ratepayers and to that end user. And so it has, I think it's been, it's good to be watching it from afar, and we look forward to bringing in the lessons learned as those are more and more determined.
Yeah, I think it underlines the issue that is part of the statute, which is that all of the board members and the ERO itself are going to have to act independently from the users, owners, and operators of the grid. And so when, if I sit on this board eventually and I still work for REAP, I'm not there to represent REAP. I might bring up interest that REAP has interest in. Just like Julie would not be there to represent MEA, she might bring up interest that MEA has, but ultimately everybody who's going to be sitting on this board has to have the Railbelt writ large as what they care about. So that's where the independence comes from. That's where our loyalties must be, is to the Railbelt, not to our individual entities.
And Tony, you had an additional comment on ERCOT?
Yeah, I agree with what's been said, and there will be lessons to be learned for some time. In my background, sometimes it would take up to 2 years to get the formal federal report that would really go through exactly what happened and who was responsible. I know that ERCOT was a result of legislation in Texas. I saw something the other day that it had saved ratepayers $3 billion up until the incident, which is estimated at $15 billion. I think the primary difference is that we are very much focused on resiliency because we have no choices, and we are in a subarctic and seismic climate, and having been in the utility business a while and in the lower 48, you can find places that have very cold climates. You can find them that have seismic regions, but not both. And Alaska lives with, I refer to it as a third world country plus standard of resiliency. And think about Anchorage North, one road goes out and that's it. One bridge goes down and that's it. We have one gas pipeline goes down, that's it. We're one transmission line and that's it. It's a real focus and the real challenge for us, especially at MEA, is it's a high priority, is we have relatively small consumer bases to pay for these kinds of things. We're not FERC regulated right now. If we were, we would have to have 2 transmission lines north and 2 south to the Kenai. And we'd all love to see that. And we continue to plan and look for ways to make that happen. But it's unfortunately a cost benefit analysis where you're always weighing risk against what members really want. I don't think they'd want to see rates doubled for one less outage a year, just as an example. So there'll be a lot of lessons learned from ERCOT. And as somebody, as a utility manager, I can assure you it's something we dream would probably be the good word, but we're thinking about night and day. It's a concern we have all the time as the holder of the CPCN.
Okay, thank you, Tony. With regard to the 2018 reliability standards that were never, I guess, formally adopted or promulgated, can you guys speak to, is that something that the IC is looking at to recommend and move forward? And where can the public view those reliability standards?
Well, the Railbelt Reliability Council isn't a incorporated entity yet, and it's not been certificated yet. But when it is, hopefully both of those things, it will definitely have a process to be looking at those standards and to make sure that those are the standards that we want to bring forth to the commission. And so right now we're developing processes for how that would happen. Those are public. I think they're on the Regulatory Commission of Alaska website. I'm not sure where else you can find them.
We can get that link for you, Annetta. Yeah, the reliability standards, even though the RCA, my understanding is they were waiting for this kind of more formal process to move through for final acceptance and to understand how to accept them all. But we're using them right now. So we are, all of the utilities have been operating under these reliability standards. We're adding more to them around security, cybersecurity, and physical security. So they're in practice, and we look forward to the RRC practice or process where we can have a larger group of stakeholders around, make sure that this does still meet the needs of the rail belt with all these other voices, and file them as appropriate regulations dictate through the RCA. But as mentioned, that they are on file now, and we can get that link.
Right. Thanks. I'll share that with the group. You know, you're talking about this development process, this parallel development process between what you're doing with the IC and what the RCA is doing, and various deadlines. I have a couple of questions from Gary Newman. You know, what is the likelihood of the RCA meeting the July deadline, and how will that impact the proposed October 1 RRC application?
Well, I'm certainly counting on them making the deadline. They have a lot of work to do, certainly, but I'm counting on that deadline at this point.
Yeah, I think the RCA is driving hard towards that deadline. I think because it's a truncated process, there are timelines that are truncated and standard processes that are followed in our dockets that just cannot be followed in this docket. And so I think that it'll depend probably on the Department of Law review that they get at the final, because that's, you know, that will then dictate, does it have to go back for further, or can we move forward with what we've created? So it will be a race to the finish, and hope we all make it in one piece.
We've got a couple of questions with regard to the integrated resource planning process. And that's strictly a CapEx planning process. It's not any of the operability standards or reliability standards included.
The integrated, is that?
Yes.
Integrated resource planning usually starts with the standards. What are the reliability standards that you have to meet, and where are the opportunities, where are the needs going forward from a load perspective, where are the needs from a reliability standpoint? And so they are almost always grounded in that, in those reliability standards, having a cost. And then the RCA right now is also trying to define this kind of greatest good. And so that's where it gets a little more subjective. And so it will be interesting to see how that plays out. But the reliability standards are traditionally the foundation.
Yeah, the statute requires the greatest value consistent with the obligations of the load serving entity. So there are going to be some regulations that try to define what that means. And of course, the other thing is that you're looking out 20 years. So you're both looking out over the horizon, trying to figure out what the demand's going to be and what technologies might be available, while at the same time developing a short-term action plan for what you do in the next 5 years, let's say.
And as Chris mentioned, if right now the RCA has gone between 3 and 4 year requirements, so it will be a continuous process.
So you're talking about the IRP being a 20-year plan, but with iterative 3-year implementation action plans. Is that how you're characterizing it, or?
Well, not exactly. There's going to be a new plan required every 3 years, and each of those plans continuously looks out 20 years. And each of those plans is also going to have within it an action plan that is not necessarily stated, what time period that has to cover, but it's really like, what do we do now? Okay, we're looking at 20 years, but what do we do now? And then 3 years later, there'll be another plan that says, what do we do now? So there'll be a continuous, I think, effort to keep up with both demand going back and forth, up and down, as well as technology opportunities and other changes that we have to react to.
That sounds like it's going to be a very expensive continuous planning process.
Well, the way I look at it is relative to the amount of CapEx that you're spending, it's not. The only other regional plan that's ever been done for the rail belt was done by the Alaska Energy Authority about 10 years ago, and it cost about $1 million. But if you divide that $1 million into more than 250,000 meters, that's $4 per plan. That covers 3 years, so it's less than $1 per customer. I'm doing that math per year to have planning that could potentially save you hundreds of millions of dollars. So I guess that's the way that a lot of us would look at it.
Well, looking forward, I mean, all of the participating utilities are going to have capital needs coming into that process. So what will be the process for integrating all of that, at least initially, and doing that prioritization process? It seems like it would be a fairly significant hurdle to get past in terms of balancing out all of those initial capital needs.
Absolutely.
We're still working that out, Winetta, the process that is. But I would suspect that a lot of the initial focus would not be on new generation projects, because a lot of new generation projects just got built. I think a lot of the focus in the early years is going to be on transmission projects. And then how do those transmission projects benefit one party next to the next party, and how do you allocate those costs? Do you socialize them completely, or do you try to distribute them based on cost benefit? So that's the way I see it happening in the early years. There's a lot of focus on transmission.
Yeah, I think it'll be focused on how to optimize our current system, both from a reliability standpoint, as well as making sure that we're getting the most from the assets on the system. And that will be, as Chris said, I think priority. There's also going to be a certain level of projects that are just really utility specific and may be just done at the utility level. And that's another part of the process that we need to look into and understand how that all folds in into the, especially around the large project pre-approval.
Mhm.
The projects under 15 megawatts are not subject to that. And refurbishment projects aren't subject to the law. So there are some, as Julie pointed out, a lot of things that I think the utilities will continue to be able to do to keep their own systems going.
Great. All right, well, I think that's all the questions that we have time for today. We've got a few that we didn't get to, but appreciate everybody's patience. We're a little bit quarter past the hour. And let me turn back to Mary Ann for any closing remarks.
No, I just think this was a great discussion. I think it was way too short. I think we need to have a subsequent, discussion on this very important issue. But thank you both for the presentation, and I look forward to session 2 on Railbelt reliability. Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks, everyone.